Hello, beautiful community. Let's talk about the arson attacks on two properties linked with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and a vehicle formerly linked with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. In one of the properties, the Prime Minister's sister-in-law is residing. The perpetrators are of Ukrainian background and they didn't know the big picture, whatever the big picture is, of what they were doing. They were petty cash criminals, and they escalated from Islamophobic graffiti to arson. But according to investigations at the BBC and by the Financial Times, there is a link between the Russian guy on Telegram who was directing these criminals and Russian sabotage networks. I won't legislate on the nature of these links. I'll leave you to read the investigations and make up your mind for yourself, because quite frankly, I'm just interested in what you as Western citizens committed to your democratic institutions make of this. And I'm interested as a pattern, right? Whatever the exact details about this case might be. And I'm interested in you not making a special mistake and falling for Russian propaganda in the way that a lot of us still do, including in this community. You might say, well, I'm hyper alert about Russian propaganda. What do you mean that I'm falling for it? Well, one way to fall for Russian propaganda is to be hyper alert about it, but in the wrong way. So let's talk about this. Since this story, what's happened is that Russia linked accounts have spread the disinformation that these criminals were rent boys hired by Keir Starmer and Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, Tommy Robinson, ventilated and spread this misinformation more widely on his social media. So what does Russian propaganda want you to do? Let's start with you. And who are you? Let's say you are pro-institutional, pro-constitutional citizen in the UK, but it could be another Western country, who votes against Nigel Farage, who votes against reform, votes against Restore UK, and perhaps is worried about centrist technocracy because there's this guy Vlad online who keeps going on about how centrist technocracy is bad. But apart from that, wants to preserve democratic institutions. What does Russian propaganda want you to think? Russian propaganda wants you to think that Tommy Robinson is a Russian asset. And you might say, well, but I mean, has he ventilated Russian propaganda? Yes. Has he gone to Russia and sucked up to the Kremlin? Yes. So what's the issue here? Isn't he at least a useful idiot or some kind of Russian stooge? Well, Russian propaganda wants you to think that a figure like Tony Robinson is essentially a foreign enemy state operation that is an attack from abroad, an attack of an external kind on your democracy. And that means that people who vote for the sorts of politics that Tony Robinson likes are, within that mindset, essentially being duped by a foreign influence operation. And they're being duped either because they are silly, or because they are morally corrupted, or because they are so frustrated and alienated and disempowered that they want to blow everything up. And so therefore you land in this place of regarding these people as inadvertent enemies of your country. What does Russian propaganda want Tommy Robinson's supporters to think? It wants them to think that centrist technocracies and their supporters are essentially so authoritarian and perhaps fascist that they take organic domestic grievance of a patriotic and nationalistic kind to be some kind of foreign influence operation. And so what you've got is the generation of a situation where both parties treat one another not as opponents but as enemies. So Vlad, what do you want me to do about this? How do you beat Russian propaganda discourse just within one's own breast at least, how does one not fall for it? Fall for doing what Russian propaganda wants one to do. What one does is double-mindedness. So here is what you need to do. Does Tommy Robinson ventilate Russian narratives? Yes. Does he suck up to the Kremlin? Yes. Is he largely a domestic political actor, surfing for self-advantage with a bit of bogus sense of mission there too, of course, surfing the sentiments of citizens in his country inflected by algorithms. Algorithms might be owned abroad, but they're still in the West. So Western citizens' sentiments plus the way they're inflected by algorithms is served by Tommy Robinson. And then you've got to give a percentage roughly in your head. If Tommy Robinson is a 5% or a 10% useful idiot for the Russians, that means he's 90% a domestic political actor. If he is 30% this or that for the Russians, he's 70% a domestic political actor. What Russian propaganda wants you to do is see that he is a little bit a purveyor of Russian disinformation and conclude from that that that's all he is. It wants you to asphyxiate inside you that double-mindedness. Because once you do that, you're going to simply lose the capacity to engage in conflict constructively with fellow citizens who vote differently to you and in a way that you perceive as perhaps understandable, but in the end destructive. So what's important here is that the best way to resist Russian propaganda, if you're somebody who's already hyper alert about Russian propaganda, is by being hyper alert about it in the right way and not collapsing into, right, a simplification of reality that in fact benefits the Kremlin's purpose, which is that we have shrill and toxic division that undermines our democracies. So what you've got to understand about the importance of this double-mindedness is that the Russians don't just want to fuel and dramatize everything that already divides us. The Russians specifically want us to be divided about the very question of Russian interference. In other words, they want us to have toxic fights with one another about the extent and the scale of Russian interference. Don't fall into that trap by being double-minded. That's all you need to do. Is somebody purveying Russian propaganda narratives? Yes. Is somebody still mostly a domestic political actor? Yes. Algorithms and the internet wants you to move from A to saying that's the whole story, there is no B. Right? You've got to be able to hold two in mind at the same time. So the best way we resist this kind of hybrid attack on us by the Kremlin is by understanding how to engage in conflict constructively with fellow citizens and understanding how to keep two things in mind at the same time. That somebody might have fallen for some kind of nasty Russian stuff and that somebody is at the same time entirely predominantly a domestic political actor. There could be cases where it's all Russian. But what you shouldn't do is confuse cases where it's a bit Russian for it being a lot Russian or even most Russian or even all Russian. Right? So that kind of double-mindedness is incredibly important and the Kremlin wants you to use it. Right? So when people go on Twitter and call somebody who is essentially a domestic Western political actor, who's fallen to some degree for Russian narratives, a Russian actor, Russian agent, a Russian asset, they're playing into what Russian propaganda wants, right? Because if disagreement in our democracy is interminable and is both substantive and procedural, and we can't agree on anything, and we can't agree on the kind of institutions that we need, then they win. because Russia's theory of victory, not just in Ukraine, but in every larger sense you can conceive of, is the self-immolation of Western democracies, somewhat accelerated, somewhat pushed on by a little bit of Russian interference around the edges. So that's the big lesson. It's a hard lesson because the temptation is to say, my prime minister attacked, Russian links, UK political actors are not standing up for my prime minister, and they're peddling some Russian propaganda. They are essentially instruments of foreign power. Blah, blah, blah. Right? That's what Russian propaganda wants you to do. Be careful, because what you in fact should do is do a bit of that, but also create that space for understanding. Sorry, I'm speaking to us like we're 4 years old, but algorithms turn us into 4-year-olds. But it also wants us to create, we also should create the space, and it doesn't want us to create the space that helps us appreciate that most of these actors are preponderantly domestic. Thanks for tolerating this rant. Lots of love. Talk soon. And if you're in the UK, give me your England prediction or your reaction if the game's already happened when you watch this, to the England-Croatia game. Lots of love.